In this series of short videos on slavery, we'll look at the nature of slavery, or as Kenneth Stamp, the famed historian, termed it, the peculiar institution. It's just flat odd that slavery developed in the land of liberty and freedom. The first of these videos will look at not only the slave numbers, but how slavery was enforced, its punishments, the mechanisms of slavery. You have to understand that slavery as an institution moved to the Southwest, the area of Alabama and Mississippi, with the production of cotton. Eli Whitney's cotton gin in the 1790s had made slave cotton profitable, and slavery moved from the upper South, the old tobacco South, to the Southwest, the areas from East Texas all the way through Alabama. And so the number of slaves was moving in that direction too. You can certainly see this in the total number of slaves. In 1790, at the time of the first census, there were approximately 700,000 slaves in the United States. Now, 70 years later, in the 1860 census, the number was approximately 3,900,000. Now, of this figure, the cotton Southwest, Alabama, Mississippi, and so forth, they led with almost 2 million slaves. Virginia was still ahead in the total number of slaves in a single state, but Alabama and Mississippi were about to overtake her. Overall, the rate of growth in all the lower Southwest cotton states vastly outpaced Virginia's slave growth, and actually Maryland's slave growth in the late antebellum period declined. All of these numbers can get confusing, because if you look at slavery, of the 4 million slaves in 1860 or so, there were less than 400,000 slave owners, out of a total white population of approximately 8 million. This means that the overwhelming number of Southern whites had neither slaves nor an immediate economic interest in slavery as an institution. Now, of the slaves that did own white, most of the slaves were owned by a few whites. The vast number of slave owners owned only a few, but the ones that owned a lot on these large Southern plantations, they dominated society. The fact that slavery came to dominate the political and economic thinking of the entire South, shaping its cultural and social patterns, is due to two main reasons. Again, the great majority of staple crops that were so important to the American economy were produced on plantations that employed slave labor. Now, there weren't many of these plantations, but these owners owned a great deal of slaves, and they had an influence far greater than their numbers would suggest. All the non-slave owning whites and the whites that owned a few slaves, they supported the whole situation because they too hoped that one day they would acquire a large number of slaves like that minority, and thus they too would be super wealthy. So to recap, only a minority of whites owned slaves, and of those whites who owned slaves, only a minority of them owned a large number of slaves. Most of the whites who owned slaves, they were owned only one or two, and they were often found working in the fields right beside their few slaves. As the Southwest cotton areas grew, each new state adopted very tough slave laws, collectively referred to as slave codes, and they outlined what slaves could not do and the punishment they would face. Slaves had no standing in courts. That means they couldn't sue, they couldn't offer testimony. Perhaps they could against another slave or free black, but generally they couldn't offer testimony. Because they were considered irresponsible, their oaths were often considered not binding. Slaves were forbidden to own their own property. Some states didn't interfere in the small items of de facto property that a slave might have inside their cabin, but technically they couldn't own any slave property. Also, some slave owners allowed their slaves to have small plots of land if they could farm after they'd finished their slave duties. But again, that didn't really count as slave property, which was officially forbidden. Slaves couldn't strike a white person, even if they were striking that person in self-defense. The killing of a slave, no matter how malicious, was rarely regarded as murder, and the rape of a female slave was regarded as a crime only if the non-owner did it. Only then it was considered trespassing against the slave owner of the female slave owner. Now, slaves generally couldn't leave the plantation without authorization. They had to have a pass. and any whites that found them off the farm were obliged to capture them and turn them over to public officials. Most slaves couldn't have firearms, and in Mississippi they couldn't even beat drums or blow horns. They generally had no commercial rights. They couldn't buy or sell goods. They couldn't have relationships with whites or free blacks. And anything that might worry a slave owner was generally discouraged. They couldn't entertain other slaves in large numbers or free blacks in large numbers in their quarters unless a white person was present. Generally, a white person had to always be present to make sure things weren't going in a direction they shouldn't go. Educating a slave was illegal technically. Now, a slave owner might be nice and educate a single slave, but if you had a slave school or you tried to educate large numbers of slaves, you could run afoul of the slave codes. In general, slaves were considered complete, absolute chattel property, and in most cases, these slave codes became even more restrictive as the years passed, and there was always ample machinery set up to ensure effective enforcement of the slave codes. Now, some states, slaves might be tried in regular courts of whites if the slaves were accused of a crime, while in other states they created special slave tribunals of whites just for those slaves. Regardless, it was the courts were run by the white slave owners. And some of the punishments that these courts would give out were as harsh as they were during the colonial period. The slave courts often relied on antebellum pamphlets that were published, and they discussed proper plantation management, and they prescribed relentless punishment usually. Such pamphlets were bestsellers and argued that without brutal control, slaves would always try to push the system. One thing that these pamphlets pushed and slave courts sometimes meshed out were putting the offending slave in irons, ball and chain attached to their legs and arms. But this was often used in conjunction with no food or no water or solitary confinement. Whipping was common for minor offenses, and slaves actually preferred whipping because while it was brutal, it was short. And here you see a slave that had been whipped so much that you can see the scars on his back. It's just brutal. The worst beatings were with a long, rough wooden club, perhaps with screws coming out of the end. But equally notorious were sort of like they call them the cowhides. It was a hammer-thick leather strap with an elastic thin end, and when you'd whip it, the thin end would cut like a knife and sting. Lash. Most common was some version of the lash, described by one overseer as, quote, a large rope of many strands. The strands unraveled in a knot tied to the extremity of each. One blow would make up to 9 wounds. Slaves were often whipped in public, better to scare the other slaves, and they would be stretched out to ensure that their skin was sliced open. The usual dose was 39 strikes, quote, well laid on, unquote. For really serious crimes such as arson or raping a white woman or a conspiracy to rebel, these sometimes could be capital offenses. And there was considerable reluctance to imprison a slave for a long time or to inflict death simply because it would deprive the owner of the labor of that slave. But another harsh punishment was branding. And that would disfigure a slave. To a slave, the worst punishment probably would be to be separated from your family. They would say, if you don't stop misbehaving, I'm going to sell you away from your kids, and you'll never see them again. One of the most important mechanisms for enforcing the slave codes was the patrol. It was sort of an adaptation of the militia. Counties were usually divided into what they called beats, or areas of patrol, and all free white men were called to serve for a period anywhere from 1 to 6 months. Now, the whites generally didn't want to serve on it. It was considered a pain in the butt, and a lot of times they would simply incur a fee or a fine for not serving. Some others might hire proxy to serve, but their efforts had to ensure that the patrol continued. And the patrol would go around their beat, and they would see African Americans out, and they asked to see their passes, make sure they were free black or they weren't escaped slaves. And so you better have your pass if you're an African American. In times of a scare or emergency, you might get extra patrols, or even a vigilante committee might form. And of course, this probably meant that they would search specifically for escaped slave or one accused of a crime and lynch them. They just bypassed any judicial system. And anyway, this concludes the first of the series of videos on the nature of slavery, this video being on the slave punishment.